Good morning. Good morning and welcome to Convocation today. Thanks for being here. Today we welcome our speaker, Eric Massanari, along with current Bethel students Erica Herzeg, Leah Groves, and Zach Cannell. Eric has served as the chaplain of Kidron Bethel Village, a retirement community here in North Newton, for almost 9 years. Prior to that, he was pastor of Shalom Mennonite Church in Newton for 14 years. Eric holds a certification in spiritual direction and has a private practice, spiritual direction, and retreat leadership ministry. Eric serves on the board of directors of Spiritual Directors International and on the steering committee of the Mennonite Spiritual Directors Network. Most recently, his writing and teaching has focused on the areas of spiritual formation, aging, grief and loss, and caring for people at the end of life. Eric is an avid poet and essayist, and he enjoys travel and exploring wild landscapes together with his wife, Yolanda. Eric, welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you, Erica, Leah, and Zach this morning.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here with you this morning. This feels very different than other convocations that I've helped with at Bethel in the past. I've done a couple in the past, but they've been in Crable Auditorium, and this is a decidedly different feel to meet in this space. But it's kind of familiar. It's a bit like church because the front rows are empty and people fill in from the back. But it's good to be with you. And I'm especially grateful to have Erica and Leah and Zach here to share too. You know, we're here to share about something that on one hand we're all familiar with to varying degrees, and that is aging, growing older. We all experience that, right? But today in particular I want to talk about what happens when you grow much older, the elders in our lives, what they experience, and also the importance of connecting our lives with theirs. I want to begin by just naming a few provisos, a few assumptions that I bring to this sharing today. One is that, to be very clear, I don't come as an expert or an authority in anything, most especially aging, growing old, and coming to the end of a life, to face one's death. As I've companioned people on those journeys for a number of years, I am as convinced as ever that we all age differently. And when the time comes, we all come to our death differently. And at the same time we do that, we age in deep interconnection with one another, with other lives, with life as a whole. I bring here the fundamental belief that there is inherent value in every single human life, and there is inherent value at every stage of a human life. I come today with the assumption that aging is not a malady, it is not a growing pathology, but aging is an opportunity for continued growth, transformation, deepening into life and love. The psychologist Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Not who you think you should be, not who other people think you should be. The privilege is to become who you are over time." And I bring the assumption that's best done with something of, as the Zen Buddhists say, a beginner's mind. The humility to come to a day, to come to this day and to say, I've never been here before. Who is this person today? What is this here that I've never encountered before? Finally, I would say, by way of introduction, I reserve the right to revise or debunk anything I say here today when I age into I'm in my 50s now, when I get into my 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, if I'm given that opportunity, I will likely look back on moments like this and the notes from a presentation like this, and I'd likely laugh, get a good chuckle. As we age, our perspective is ever changing. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus famously said, "You never step into the same river twice." The currents of life, the circumstances we live into, are always changing. Our bodies, our minds, our whole being, always changing. Throughout history, throughout cultures around the world, people have had different ways of talking about that. One of the most ancient frameworks for understanding aging and staging comes from India and the Hindu tradition. In the Vedic scriptures, very ancient scriptures, thousands of years old from Hinduism, there is the understanding of the Four Ashramas, or literally means dwelling places for a human life. And I realize you're not going to be able to read some of this at a distance, so I'll be sure to read what's on the screen. Those 4 stages in that tradition, the Brahmacharya is the first one, the student, from a young child age, about 3 years old, to young adulthood. It's the stage of learning, growing, formation. The second stage, the grihastha, the householder as it's called, from about the age of many of you here today to about age 60. It's a big span. But a lot happens there. We develop an occupation, a career. We might establish a family, raise children. Then later comes the vanaprastha, the retiree, about age 60 to age 80, less active in the world in a profession or raising children, but still it was understood this is a very active stage of life where one generatively shares wisdom that's been gleaned through life. It's an important stage for sharing to younger generations. Finally, the sannyasa, the renunciate, in that tradition understood to be 80 and above, often the oldest of the old. Though interestingly, in the Hindu tradition, they believed at various places in adulthood you could take the vow of a sannyasa. If you felt ready to kind of let go of many of the responsibilities of the day-to-day life and walk a deeper spiritual journey of awakening, facing your own mortality and death. Now, there are many other frameworks for understanding aging and development. You might recognize, you're not going to be able to read the words here, but just that diagram from your general psychology textbooks in high school or college, that happens to be a diagram of Erik Erikson's stages of human psychosocial development. One of many models that have been proposed, but Erikson himself proposed there are 8 ages, key ages and stages, from infant to toddler to preschooler, grade schooler, teenager, young adult, middle-aged adult, and older adult. And he argued that for each of these ages and stages, there's certain tasks, certain agenda that needs to be addressed, questions to be explored. So, like the infant is wondering, can I trust this world I've been born into? The toddler, is it okay to be me in this world? The preschooler, is it okay for me to do, to act, to engage? The teenager, who am I? What's my identity in this world? The young adult, wondering about intimacy, asking, am I able to love and be loved? The middle-aged adult, wondering, can I make this life count? Can I help change this world? The older adult, wondering in reflection, has it been okay to be me? Did I live well? Now, as you see from the picture, Erikson, like many Western models for aging, paints things as sort of a staircase or a line that's progressive, stages, steps. His wife, who was also his colleague, Joan Erikson, after he died, she wrote a book called The Life Cycle Completed. Notice the different language, cycle, circular. She proposed that actually when you get old enough, nearing the end of a life, facing your mortality, dealing with some of the losses of aging, the question becomes the same as at the very beginning of life. Can I trust this? Can I trust this? The infant's question. The oldest of the old ask that, from my experience, as they face into death. Can I trust what comes next? Now, of course, as a society, we divide people into ages, stages of life in more colloquial ways, like when we talk about generations. Gen X, Gen Y, Millennials, Gen Z. Lots of ways we break people up or our own lives up into stages and ages, but when you yourself are growing older, you know there's no clean-cut lines that delineate when you've reached some new stage. You age day to day, don't you? Moment to moment. Furthermore, in a society like ours that's prone to categorizing, we start applying value to different ages and stages. And we do that based upon some of our societal values, things like speed, productivity, strength, power, social influence, youthfulness, vigor, novelty, and so forth. With those as primary valuations of being human and engaging the world, in a culture like ours, we have a tendency to devalue the youngest and the oldest among us. Our word for that is ageism. Probably a word that doesn't need a lot of explanation. I think we know what that is when we hear it, see it, feel it in ourselves. I would define it as devaluing, dismissing, dehumanizing people based on their age, their stage of life. Ageism sounds like, you're too young to understand. Wait till you get older and get more experience. All teenagers care about is themselves. Or the recently popular meme, okay, boomer. Old people are so out of touch with what's happening in the world. Old people are so conservative and stuck in their ways. Old people need to move aside and let the young lead. Those are some of the voices of ageism. Our society particularly struggles with what to do with the old, the elders, because I think something in us knows that as we grow old, it inevitably means losing, loss, facing great losses. Inevitably, it means coming face to face with our mortality if we haven't had a chance to do that yet. We have a hard time remembering when we see the eldest among us what Thomas Mann, the novelist, once said, "It will happen to me as to them." If you're given the gift of a long life, it will happen to you. Guaranteed. You will grow old. And what you observe there will be your journey in your own way, too. I had a friend at Kidron Bethel Village, a resident there. And I can share his name. He gave me permission to share this story while he was still alive. His name was John. One of his passions was sculpting wood. He was a very gifted wood sculptor. And I share that because it's important for this little moment I'll tell you of. When I met him in the hallway one day in healthcare, he was nearing the end of his life, facing growing dementia and debilitating physical illness. He was in a wheelchair pushing himself along, and he looked at me. And he motioned me over and he said, What is this? I didn't know what he meant at first. He was saying, "What is this?" And then he said, "Sometimes it just feels like life is carving away at you and chips are flying everywhere. And I don't know what's emerging," he said. And you could hear the grief, but just that image he used of his own art form held, I think for him, you could hear the hope, the possibility, like, I don't know what this is, it's tearing me up, it's carving me away, but I sense something is being sculpted here, and I'm trusting that. John O'Donohue once wrote these words. He said, and you're going to recognize maybe some of the people in these photos. There's some photos here of Bethel students who've come for different events at Kidron. O'Donohue said, "Aging is so frightening because it seems your autonomy and independence are forsaking you against your will. To the young, old people seem ancient. When you begin to age yourself, you recognize how incredibly quickly time is moving. Modern society is totally obsessed with externality, image, speed, change. We are driven. Consequently, old people are often sidelined, though in former times, old people were seen as those who had the greatest wisdom." Again, from Carl Jung said, "One cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning. For what was great in the morning will be of little importance in the evening, and what in the morning was true, at evening will have become a lie." In other words, at each age and stage of life, maybe you're discovering yourself, there are certain things that are being called out of you that need your attention. And they are different than they were when you were younger. And they will be different as you grow older. And it makes no sense to say one is better than the other. They make sense for the time that you're in, the moment that you're living. Another quote here on the page, in case you can't read it. Maggie Kuhn, who was an activist in the mid-20th century, she founded the Gray Panthers in the 1960s. She said, "Old age is not a disease. It is strength. It is survivorship." One of my favorite quotes, I didn't include here, but comes from Louis Cronenberger, a literary critic. He said, "You know, old age is an excellent time for outrage." An excellent time for outrage. He said, "My goal is to say or do at least one outrageous thing a week." And I wanted to show you an example of that. Maybe you saw this in the news about a week, 2 weeks ago. Yelena Osipova is a Russian artist, an activist. She was protesting on the streets of St. Petersburg on March 2nd into March 3rd, joining other protesters who were crying out against what her country was doing to the Ukrainians. And this picture was taken as this physically frail, but I would say spiritually fierce, old woman was being led off to prison by these burly, heavily armed soldiers. To me, that's how an elder can lead. I use the term elder a lot. I think it's the term I've come to that feels like it shows most respect for what can emerge in old age, and that is wisdom that the world needs. And I want to read this quote describing an elder. This is from Barry Barkin. He said, "An elder is a person who is still growing, still a learner, still with potential, and whose life continues to have within it promise for and connection to the future. An elder is still in pursuit of happiness, joy, pleasure, and her or his or their birthright to these remain intact. Moreover, an elder is a person who deserves respect and honor, whose work it is to synthesize wisdom from a long life experience and formulate this into a legacy for future generations, as a gift to those of us who are younger." I want to invite now Erica and Leah and Zach to share with you, each of them, a little insight into how their interactions with elders have benefited them. And I'll just share with you, Erica works in our nursing department at Kidron Bethel Village. Leah works in our life enrichment program. Zach is one of our health screeners that we've had to employ during the COVID pandemic. So thank you all for your sharing.
Okay, so I'm Erica Herzeg, and I'm a senior nursing student. I've been in the nursing field since I graduated high school almost 9 years ago. I've worked as a CNA, and I'm currently an LPN for almost 6 years. All these 9 years of my experience in nursing, I've worked with the geriatric population. Through my clinical experience, I have watched life being born through labor and delivery clinicals. I've experienced pediatrics, and then with my work experience, I've worked with the elderly. I've seen both the beginning of life as well as the end of life. All types of nursing is special, but I hold the elderly and geriatrics very close to my heart. As I have been growing up myself, I have spent my whole young adult life caring for the elderly. In the last 9 years working with the elderly, I've learned so much about myself. As they are growing older every day, so am I. I think I've learned that growing old isn't as scary as people think it might be. You get to look back at the wonderful life you've lived and reminisce on all the memories. Being able to provide care for someone in their last moments of life and of their end of life can be extremely sad, but it can also provide you so much happiness. Being at the bedside with the elderly when they're passing away and caring for them in such a personal and special way. The family is gathered around the bedside, and you're hearing all of the happy moments and providing emotional support is something that I truly do love about my job. The residents, especially at Kidron, have pushed me in my education. Many of them are Bethel alum. They continually ask me how my classes are going, how my tests have been. They're excited to go through my educational journey with me. I think what has challenged me the most has been building a relation with them like they're your grandma or grandpa, and then having to say goodbye to them so soon. Not getting a lot of time with them, and then you are there with them more than you're with your own family. You're working 12-hour shifts, you're there for all 3 meals if you work day shift, you're getting them up for the day, you're getting them ready for bed right after supper. The pandemic is something that has really hit us hard in long-term care. We were their caregivers as well as their loved ones. They couldn't leave their rooms at some times, and then social isolation was really devastating to many of them. Many didn't understand with our Alzheimer's and dementia why they're visiting their loved ones through the windows. I think this was a huge obstacle to learn how to be caregivers, and now we're their only social interaction. I think the hardest thing for me during this time was losing residents when there was the travel restrictions. I remember being there for one of the residents that was very close to death. She was at the end of the life process, so she was no longer verbal. And I remember holding an iPad near her while her daughter was out of state, and they had to say their goodbyes over the FaceTime. The most special experience I think I've had in my career as a nurse was when I was able to care for my grandpa. My sisters and I cared for him and just like any other patients. We bathed him, we cared for him, everything up and personal. My family sat around his bedside while he was passing, talking about all the funny things he's done in life, all the happy moments we've had him for, and realizing he was taking his last breaths. I was able to listen to my grandpa's final heart and be the second person to ensure that there was no heartbeat. This is something that I will carry with me the rest of my career. I think caring for the elders is such a rewarding career path, and I wish everyone could have the chance to experience it in one way or another. You will learn so much about yourself, and they will push you just like you're just one of their own grandchildren.
My name's Leah, and I'm going to be sharing about the work I do. Thanks. The work I do with residents. So one of the people I'm speaking about is actually on the screen. Her name's Elizabeth, and that was taken when she was 100. So yeah, life doesn't stop. I've been at Kidron for a little more than 2 years now. I've had so many residents impact my life, and during that time, a particular woman impacted my life. Her name was Elizabeth. She moved into healthcare at 99 and passed at the age of 101. I remember the first day she moved in. She was sitting in the pod area, and I went to introduce myself. She wasn't too excited about moving in, and I tried to hype it up. And she's like, "Why would I want to move here?" And I said, "Well, you get to see me every day." And she said, "Well, I guess that's good enough." This lady had never met me before, but was so welcoming it really spoke about her character. She was constantly wanting to learn about technology and was so amazed at the things that had evolved in her lifetime. There wasn't ever a day where she didn't check in with me and ask how my day was. I would talk about school with her, and she would share stories of her life with me. During the 2 years I learned to know her, she would always tell me how proud of me she was. I never knew what made her take an interest in my life. She didn't have to take an interest or care or even smile at me, but because she did, it affirmed that I want to work with healthcare residents. Elizabeth passed a few days before this last Christmas, and there are still days I walk past her room and expect to see her wave at me. She is someone that I try and model my life after, and that will impact me forever. And then the second person I'm going to share about, oddly enough, her name is also Elizabeth. She was only there for 2 months, but during those 2 months, I felt like I was part of her family. She was able to make connections with me about people we both knew, and I learned so much about her love and dedication for Southern Hills Mennonite Church, because she was the last surviving founding member. The day she passed, I went in there, and she thanked me for everything I had done for her. She told me she would miss me, but knew she would see me again. When I think about my job, I really don't think that I could have had that big of an impact on someone's life, especially in 2 months. But when Elizabeth thanked me for what I had done while she was at Kidron, just a few hours before she passed, that really put into perspective how much my work can affect someone's life and how important relationships are and how they continued to grow until the very end.
Morning, everybody. My name is Zach Cannell, and like these folks, I work at Kidron. And my job at Kidron is a little bit different than what these people do. I'm a health screener, so I check the nurses in when they come for their shift. I take their temperature, make sure they're feeling all right, and I help facilitate visitors now that Kidron allows family to visit their relatives who are in Kidron. And my work gives me a lot of opportunities to interact with the residents on their way to and from meals, as I work right outside of one of the dining halls. And some of my favorite memories from Kidron are always when the residents are going to eat, because of how differently they all approach the meals. Some residents are absolutely just so excited to eat supper. There's one resident that is always out to eat 30 minutes before anybody else is, to make sure that he gets his spot and to make sure that he is the first person to get food. There's other residents. One resident has lost her ability to taste, and so sometimes someone will ask her, like, "Oh, are you excited for supper today?" And she'll laugh and say, "Oh, no, not particularly, but I figure I should come anyway." And it kind of just makes me laugh. And I think working at Kidron has given me a really good opportunity to be reminded that even if someone's cognitive and physical functions aren't what they used to be, that person still has a lot of things that they can contribute to society and can contribute to other people. So, yeah.
Thank you, each of you. And I would encourage you, to ask them more about their experiences. We have a number of other Bethel students who work on our campus. I know a number of you have been there and volunteered in various capacities, and we are very grateful for that. Something Zach said there at the end, acknowledging the deep value of a human life, even as things like cognitive capacities, physical abilities decline, I think is a really important observation. You know, we say in the society, I've heard it said a lot in the last 2 years, that our elders are among the most vulnerable people of our society. And it's true. From a certain point of view, that is very true. Vulnerable physically, for sure. We've seen that in the pandemic. They have suffered, as a population, immensely during the pandemic, not just with the COVID infections that they might get, but as was indicated in some of the stories, the isolation experienced over the last 2 years by many elders, profound. But what I want to offer you, before I tell you one last story, I want to offer maybe a slightly different perspective on vulnerability. I would offer that maybe in a society like ours, it could be that it is the youth, it is young adults like many of you, middle-agers like me, who are among the most vulnerable in a sense. Vulnerable in terms of we run the risk of buying into these false notions that things like speed, novelty, strength, power, influence, titles, credentials, these things are the true measure of a life's value. Those of us who fall into those categories, I think, need the children in our lives who remind us of the importance of wonder, having that beginner's mind as you enter a day. And we need the elders in our midst who have faced great pain and loss in life. They are staring into the reality of death and their mortality. And through that, they have gained a certain kind of wisdom and perspective that we need, because they can remind us of what truly measures the value of a human life. And that is your very being. That is your life itself. The great gift you and I have been given to live this life for however long we're given. I'm going to tell one last story of somebody who taught me that, an unlikely person. I'm going to call her Sophie. Sophie is no longer living. Sophie was in our healthcare residences for as long as I knew her. And when I started at Kidron Bethel Village as chaplain about 9 years ago, Sophie was already living into very late stages of dementia. Words that she spoke, as we often describe it, was sort of word salad. You couldn't really make logical sense of it. She was trying to express things, but it didn't come out making sense. Sophie at that stage, and as she progressed, enjoyed sitting in a recliner most of the day out in one of the nursing pod areas where there's a lot of activity. And Sophie enjoyed, she just seemed to enjoy watching people pass by. One day I was walking down that hall, and what I remember is I was late for a meeting. And so I was distracted, as we often get, right? When we're busy, we're kind of living 2 steps ahead or 3 steps behind ourselves. We're not present to the moment. And I was kind of plowing my way down that hall, really not paying attention to the people I was encountering. And out of the corner of my eye, I could tell Sophie was there in her recliner as I went through that area. And something in my head said, just say good morning to Sophie. And so I stopped, and as I usually did, and as we often do with people with advanced dementia, we touch is a powerful way to make a connection. And so I knelt down by her chair, and I just very gently put my hand on the back of her hand. Her gaze at that point was just still off on the floor behind me over my shoulder. But I just said good morning, and I stayed there for a minute, and very slowly I could see her eyes lift up off the floor and meet my gaze, and I could feel her hand turn in mine and just give a little squeeze. And so I decided not to just get up and rush away yet. And then it was almost like a veil lifted. Her eyes got this brightness to them that I had never seen, and she looked at me very intently, and I said, "Hi, Sophie." And she looked and she said, "Oh, it's you." The clearest words I'd ever heard her speak. I don't know who she saw me to be in that moment. I have no idea. I said, "Yes, it's me, and it's good to see you this morning." And there was a pause, long pause, but she was still looking. And then this is what she said. "I think you are so alive." At that point, I literally sat back on the floor. I'd never heard her say anything like this. I said, "Sophie, I think you're so alive too." And then she just broke into this shoulder-shaking laugh I'd never heard come out of Sophie before. And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, I don't know. I think I'll be going soon, but I don't know when." And then it was like you could see the veil drop. And her gaze fell back to the floor. Her hand, the grip on my hand went slack. And that veil fell fully again. I never heard anything like that from her again. I don't know what that moment was. I don't know what I got to see in Sophie at that moment. But I know it was true and it was real. And she gave me the most precious gift and reminder in my distracted, hurried moment. You are so alive. And so I offer you Sophie's words today. You are so alive. And as obvious as that sounds, think about how often we just live in such a rush with regrets of the past, fears of the future, and we just fail to appreciate that profound, precious fact. We are alive in this world. for this moment, this day, this time, assured of nothing more than that. You are so alive. I'll read this one last quote, which I think is a beautiful statement of that life. This comes from another elder, Donna Markova. She wrote, "I will not die an unlived life, and I will not live in fear of falling or catching fire, and I will choose to inhabit my days and allow my living to open me, to make me less afraid, more accessible, to loosen my heart until it becomes a wing, a torch, a promise. I will choose to risk my significance and live so that which came to me as a seed goes on to the next as a blossom, and that which came to me as blossom goes on as fruit." May that be so in each of our lives. And we've got a few minutes here, I think, for any questions, thoughts. Maybe a story was sparked for you want to briefly share. And I would say if you have a question for any of your three student colleagues up here, I'd really encourage you to ask them. But yeah, any questions or comments you want to share before we close? Or anything more any of you want to add? If not, I'm going to let Michael bring us to a close and not keep you any longer than necessary. So thank you all for joining in today. I would encourage you to think about who are the elders in your life that you might connect more deeply with and learn from. They need you too.
Thank you again, Eric, Erica, Leah, and Zach. Thanks to all of you for being here. You are dismissed.